So we'll use the второй раз.
On the other hand, the piece must have a
Piece,
You must
у меня не вышла высокая нота. А первый раз пишется чисто.
Hello, I'm Bob Moog. I'd like to tell you a little about Clara Rockmore and about how I came to participate in this video presentation. Clara Rockmore was born Clara Reisenberg in 1911 in the city of Vilna. She showed her great love for music when she was still a very small child, and she was a concert violinist at the age of 9. As a teenager, Clara concertized widely throughout Europe. Her older sister Nadia, who was a concert pianist in her own right, accompanied Clara on piano. Clara and Nadia arrived in New York City when Clara was only 18 years old. She was introduced to Leon Theremin, who was living and working in New York at the time. Theremin was a Russian musician and physicist who was creating a sensation with his invention called the Theremin, the world's first space-controlled electronic musical instrument. To play the Theremin, the player moves her hands in the space around the instrument without touching it. Clara immediately recognized the musical potential of the Theremin and quickly became the instrument's foremost exponent. She developed virtuoso playing techniques which enabled her to perform violin, cello, and vocal pieces from the classical repertoire. From then on, Clara concertized extensively on the Theremin. She played over 100 concerts with major symphony orchestras, as well as many recitals with her sister Nadia. Through her professionalism and her musical genius, Clara Rockmore has greatly elevated the level of awareness and respect for the Theremin. I've known Clara Rockmore since the late 50s. I remembered I showed her a Theremin that I had made back then. Many years later, in 1969, Clara and Nadia came to a synthesizer concert in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. She was excited by the concert. Afterwards, she told me that she regarded her instrument, the Theremin, as the first space-age instrument, since it was controlled solely by the position of the player's hands in space. She was excited by the popularity of the synthesizer, which she then considered the most recent space-age instrument. She saw that the public had become receptive to all electronic musical instruments, and she thought that the time was right for a release of a recording and a video of her Theremin performances. After several years, we produced an album of Clara's Theremin performances with Nadia Reisenberg accompanying her on the piano, which, by the way, is still available on CD. Shortly after that, in 1976, we were able to videotape Clara and Nadia performing in Clara's 57th Street apartment in New York City. It's located a very few blocks from Carnegie Hall, where she has lived since her marriage to Robert Rockmore in 1933. In addition to Clara's demonstration and performances, we taped a conversation with Clara and Nadia and Bob Sherman, Tom Ray, and me while we were all sitting around Clara's dining room table. Friends of ours did the taping on the proverbial shoestring using an experimental Sony videotape deck. A few years later, we used parts of the video footage for a CBS Camera 3 program, which was very well received. After that, these master tapes remained in storage for many years. Unfortunately, they succumbed to the effects of age, temperature changes, and humidity. Despite some minor technical flaws inherent in this obsolete format, this footage accurately captures the feeling and the uniqueness of the event. I hope you enjoy this presentation of Clara Rockmore, the greatest Theremin virtuosa.
I will play the aria of Matheson to show the low cello register of this instrument.
I'm Bob Sherman. Across the table from me is Clara Rockmore and Nadia Reisenberg, except I always call them aunt and mother because it's simpler that way, since they happen to be. On the other side here is Robert Moog. Dr. Moog, his name is a household word now because of the synthesizer that bears it and many other electronic devices. And another doctor, Thomas Ray, with us. And Tom has made a study of electronic music, electronic instruments, and the whole historical pageant of it. So I don't know where to begin exactly, except to say that you two have found the theremin fascinating. I accept it as part of the house. I've grown up with it. It's been around. It's always been there, and I understand it. What is it that fascinates you, Bob? What do you find special about the theremin?
It's very simple, technically, considering how musically rich it is. By musically rich, I don't mean you turn it on and it plays. I mean that a skilled musician can get an incredibly rich music out of it. And yet inside, it's one of the simplest devices I know. I began building theremins as an experimenter when I was a kid in high school. And I've been at it on an amateur and semi-professional basis ever since.
If it's such a simple device, how is it that every time a tube goes out, there's a major crisis here because they were all made in 1942 and they can't be located anymore?
I think I can answer that. That is because Professor Theremin was such a genius that he picked up whatever happened to be around. So his parts there are some of them obsolete or some of them could be handled to a frying pan for all I care, but he made it work. But it's very difficult to substitute.
Clara, when did you first meet theremin? Under what circumstances?
Well, I met Professor Theremin when he came to America to demonstrate the instrument. At that time, I was a very busy violinist, a pupil of Professor Leopold Auer, and I was fascinated by the aesthetic part of the instrument, the visual, the beauty, and the idea of playing completely without touching anything. That part was very fascinating to me. I also loved the sound of it. And apparently I showed some kind of immediate, from point of view of Professor Theremin, an immediate ability to manipulate it perhaps better than the usual person. Maybe my absolute pitch helped. But at that time I was too busy playing the violin, so I completely forgot it except to admire it for several years. And only later I began to work on it. And then he changed the first model of the instrument to a much more exacting one because I needed it for musical reasons, with a faster left hand, which permits staccato, which with a longer range, 5 octaves instead of 3, which makes playing much more difficult and controlling it more difficult, but more is possible.
Wait, you're skipping a little bit ahead. From this initial stage of just being curious about it, to actually starting to work on it, to having him build you an instrument that is a little different for the specification. How did you actually begin to play it?
No, I began to play it on the regular RCA model, which was then sold at Shermer's or wherever, and it had a very beautiful tone. I was not happy with it because the left hand, I call it molasses, you know. You couldn't shake the note. You always had glissando, everything was connected. And also the range was not satisfactory to me. I wanted bass notes as well as high notes. It was all get high. And Professor Theremin became a great friend and admirer and was willing to do anything. In fact, we really worked on this particular instrument together. I making my musical demands, or not demands, probably the wrong word, wishes known to him. And he, being the genius that he was able to invent this one.
Yeah. Bob Moog, how about the recording of the theremin? Is that going to pose special problems, do you think, in terms of the sound quality being electronically generated in the first place?
No, in fact, an electronic sound is generally easier to record than an acoustic sound because we have more control over it. And since it's already in electrical form, it was generated in the first place by electricity, it obviously can exist once again in electrical form in the tape recorder. An instrument like the piano is much more difficult to record accurately.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
First of all, there is absolutely no mystery of why my hand goes down occasionally, because there is tuning. The tuning is done to give me the entire range within the span of my arm. I have 5 octaves from the vertical antenna to myself. Now, the vertical antenna controls the pitch. I'll show you. The nearer I come to it, the higher the sound. The further away, the lower the sound. Similarly, the antenna, the round one on the left, controls the volume. When the hand is down, you hear nothing. As you raise it, it gets louder and louder. I don't use it only for dynamics. I use it for cutting off, because you have to play rests as well as the notes. A note would otherwise be continuous. In order to stop it, you have to stop the sound and start it again. And if you want to keep the same volume, you have to start at the same level. Now, the sound itself can be rather, which necessitates the vibrato in order to give it nuance and give it color. Now, the same without it. Now, suppose I try. See, the difference is you have to actually mold the tone. It's not given to you. Now, the technical explanation I will not go into, except to say that the electricity generates around the instrument an electromagnetic field. And it's not only where I stand, but it's like a magic circle all around. Therefore, it's, as I said to you before, it's a very unsocial instrument. You cannot invite anyone to come near you, because if you come into the circle, you disturb the note I'm holding, even from outside. The reason why I have to hold myself completely still is because it's not only my fingers that do the work and change the pitch, but you see, it's very difficult to emote with this instrument and not shake your head or anything. You have to be in complete control of the stillness of your body in order not to destroy what you're doing. The intervals are very minute, because, as I said, you have 5 octaves within the span of your arm. And you don't only have look for the note, you have to hit the center of the note. Now, what my contribution to the technique of the instrument was that, being a violinist and a musician, I couldn't play music with a constant glissando. I mean, it just isn't done. So in order to eliminate it, I developed my own technique of fingering. See, all these things. Now, this, I don't only use this hand for dynamics, but if I want to play 2 notes legato and then 2 notes staccato, it doesn't happen by itself, so I do. Stop and eliminate. Now, also, I do eliminated what was usually done with the instrument. Any jumps were reached by easy method with glissando. I do very much what the diver would do. I just have to take a chance, and here I am. See? A hairbreadth off, and I'm already on a different note. Now, when I say tuning, all you tune is to your body capacity. You, being a little bit bigger than I am, would have to tune it a little differently. Your body capacity is different. And you have to tune so that you have the entire scale within the arm span. It would be very awkward to try to reach the basses behind your back. So the longer your arm is, the easier it's for you. My arm is not so long, so I have small intervals. Now, is there anything else you want to ask me that I forgot to mention? Ah, Dr. Ray, now we'll have fun. Now we'll have fun. Now, here, hold your hand over this so that you don't scare my neighbors. And this hand does the pitch. It's a fallacy to think that the instrument is easy to play. You know, it is much more difficult than the violin. I was a concert violinist before I played this, and you have something to hold on to. And this is the only instrument, although it is one of the earliest one, as early as almost a half a century ago when Professor Theremin invented it. But it remains the only instrument which is controlled completely in the space without touching anything at all. And I find that particularly fascinating at this time because all the younger generation are so space conscious. They go through a door that opens magically before them in a supermarket. They are not surprised. But when the instrument was invented to have this electromagnetic field with the control completely in the air, it was unheard of. And interestingly enough, it still remains the only musical instrument which is controlled completely in the air. The early Martineau had a keyboard and a sort of a steel ribbon to go on, but this is the only one that is controlled in the air. And I am myself fascinated by the idea that you can take music out of the air. Hebrew Melody by Achron.
I was curious about Theremin himself, your contact with him. He gave concerts here even before
Well,
you
he
did.
gave more or less, you would say, demonstrations. I wouldn't call them concerts because they were not really serious music, but demonstrations to show. And one of the demonstrations was at Carnegie Hall, at which time I am almost amused to say that he demonstrated for the first time a very interesting invention of his, which was a dance platform built on the same principle as my instrument, but a flat platform, not much bigger than a platform of, say, that the cellist uses or a conductor uses. And the human body, being the electric conductor, was on the platform, and that, to me, still remains the most perfect synchronization of sound and motion. Of course, of necessity, for dance, the intervals had to be much larger, and it was not a question of the span of the hand, it was a question of the span of the entire body. And poor professor looked at all the dancers, and they all tried, and with, unfortunately, not sufficiently musical results. And to my great amazement, I wound up demonstrating the dance platform at Carnegie Hall, dancing the Ave Maria. If you can dance an Ave Maria, I danced an Ave Maria. Of course, I didn't try to make leaps because I'm not a ballerina, but I did it there is a great flexibility to the motions that you can do. In other words, you're like a flower folded up. The bases are if you're folded up on the floor. And as you rise up or lift your arms, then it will be a higher sound. So you could take an octave doing this, or you might take a fifth doing that, or you might take the same fifth doing this. It was great choice of what. It didn't matter if you knew, but I could control the sound and correct pitch, which the dancers unfortunately could not.
Sounds like the name of a 19...
Now, Mom, you also had this same prodigy situation. I mean, you were also playing from the very beginning,
Well,
right?
not quite, because we had no piano before I was 6 years old. But of course, the moment a piano appeared, which was the most marvelous present my uncle gave me, I think I started to play just as soon as I touched the keys, almost.
Since my sister mentioned the uncle, I must say that he was the one who taught me at the age of 3 how to read music by making a fairy story out of it, making a game. He was the one who bought me my first quarter violin, a tiny little instrument on which I played the Bruch concerto, Mendelssohn concerto on a quarter violin. Then I gradually...
You have it still, don't
I
you?
have it. I wouldn't part with it for a million. And then I had, of course, graduated to a half violin, three-quarter violin, and took quite a while before I had my full-sized violin.
That's probably why you can handle these small spaces with a theremin. You're used to the quarter violin.
Well, I think I grew a little since then. My
And-
fingers are not that small.
And you both came to this country at the same time, then?
The whole family, all 3 sisters. We're called the Chekhov sisters. We're very close. The Song of Gruzia by Rachmaninoff.
Didn't Professor Theremin build several instruments using this principle that he had discovered besides that? A
No,
fretboard?
the only space-controlled instruments are the one I play, the space-controlled theremin and the dance platform, which, for lack of sufficiently musical dancers, apparently has never seen the light. And
Tom Ray, I was going to ask you, with all your research, is there a dance platform in a warehouse someplace that we can
Oh,
find?
I certainly hope so. A lot of these things
What
get
happened
lost
to 'em?
forever and
well,
ever.
we could ask Professor Theremin. I'm in contact
Well,
with him.
as a matter of fact, though, RCA built theremins for a little while.
Yeah, but what about dance platforms?
I don't
It was
know.
probably a one-of-a-kind device.
I
I have pictures of it, but
I could ask Professor Theremin. I heard from him as recently as 2 weeks ago.
He is
He's in
Leningrad.
Moscow.
Oh,
No,
Moscow.
he's in Moscow. He was the head of the acoustic department at the Leningrad Conservatory of Music at the time when I visited there about 10 years ago. Also, he was the head of some department at the Moscow University. And in the last letter, he gave me very exciting news. Realizing dream of mine, which one of the other demands that I made of him years ago, and he said it was impossible. I said, you invent it, and I will learn how to control it. He said, it's impossible to control. I said, just invent it. I'll learn how to control it. Now, the last letter said that he now has already realized 3-voice space control theremin. With my idea, must be very proud, incorporated that it should be given to the left hand, because it would be physically impossible to juxtapose one note against the other, because one would interfere with the other. And it was my suggestion to put it in the left hand.
How would it affect?
Well, he said that it's impossible because you have to do
Exactly.
the volume. But the volume goes up and down vertically. I said, what about the sound going, the different note, the accompaniment going horizontally? I can do the same volume here and the same volume here, and at the same time play a note.
So that doesn't,
Right.
when you say 2 or 3 voices, you don't necessarily mean in parallel. They could be going
It
in
could
which...
be 3 at once. You
Now,
don't
where,
know what I mean.
where do you get the third hand from?
It's a very good
One
question.
note for the left
Very
hand,
good
one note for the
question.
right hand, then
Very
what?
good question, but I have not, I only read it in a letter in which he invited me most cordially to come there and immediately concertize on it, and I answered that I'm a responsible person. It would take me at least a year to learn how to control before I start concertizing. And isn't there anybody in Moscow, in the conservatory, that can do better than I? And apparently he didn't find anyone yet. I hope he does. Play 3 notes. I just want to take this moment to say I'm very fortunate. I have 2 wonderful sisters, and one sister just happens to be the Nadia Reisenberg, the most wonderful pianist, and it's a joy to play with her.
How is it playing with the theremin as opposed to playing with a violin or a cello or anything else?
Well,
Is it any different from
I
your
have-
point of view?
I have only played with Clara, and I forget what instrument she plays. In other words,
you.
it wouldn't make any difference which instrument she would play. We would make music together, you see. And this is the only, I think from viewpoint of perhaps the balance, it is not particularly difficult because theremin has a certain penetrating sound which comes through. And so you can very freely give the support, and I don't think you can.
You don't have the
hurt it.
problem, let's say, with a cello of being afraid to cover certain registers and something of this
No,
sort?
not with the theremin.
You see, I have
No.
much more volume than I give here because musically I don't need to shout. I try to keep the volume within its musical necessities, but I could outshout a whole symphony orchestra if I wish to do it for special effect, but that's not necessary.
You have played with symphony orchestra, concertos,
Yes.
Shlomo, Bloch, and so on. Does that element of volume make a difference in your playing, or is it?
No, but the orchestras and the conductors are very happy with me because they can give full tone, whatever it is, and they never have to worry about covering me because I can always float on top of the. It has a soaring quality. It carries.
It's not a question of volume, I don't
But
think.
it
I think
carries.
it's a question of
I've had no
character.
difficulty. I played with all the big orchestras, and they can play fortissimos, and there I go, floating. It's very pleasant playing with orchestras. And Stokowski particularly was one of my very first admirers, and he was the one who visualized years ago when he heard me play and arranged for me to play with Philadelphia Orchestra, and then I played with him at City Center, played with him quite a few times, and he came to this house, and he visualized the idea of building around me, as he called it, a Superman electronic orchestra of 12 men that would sound as rich as a symphony orchestra. He was very excited about the idea, and went ahead with the plans, but nothing happened for two reasons. There were not enough, or rather non-existent, interesting electronic instruments, because Dr. Moog had not invented his synthesizer yet. And also, not only because of that, but the union problem. It seemed that the union got very worried. With men as big as Leopold Stokowski, they probably thought 12 men will replace immediately every symphony orchestra, which was rather short-sighted of them. But that's why this. So when I heard a record of Switch on Bach with this wonderful playing of Mr. Walter Carlos, and with the fascinating and limitless possibilities of the synthesizer, that's when I thought, well, here it is. That's Stokowski's dream. Why not make a marriage? Is that right? I said to you, let's have a belated marriage between the solo electronic voice of the Theremin and all the beautiful tonal possibilities of the synthesizer.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back then, Clara, and pick up more or less at the beginning when you began seriously playing the theremin in
You
concert.
mean in concert?
Yes.
Well, I would say that my first major appearance, which was quite major, was through Mr. Stokowski's interest, was playing the Shalom of Bloch, which is a cello work, with the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was very well received by critics like you. And subsequently, I had my first recital in New York with my dear sister here, and we played the Nardini Concerto. We played the whole César Franck Sonata, every movement, which was at that time reviewed by the Times as rather a great surprise, because the theremin was associated with just little melodies, and here I was playing Franck Sonata. And that started my career. Then I was an artist with the Columbia Management, and I did 3 coast-to-coast tours, which I played at least 150 concerts. But as I say, how many pianists are there in the world? How many violinists? But when one person plays 150 times, it still is an unknown quantity to many, many, many other people. And that's why I'm particularly interested now in the younger generation, reacquainting them with, they are much more space conscious, they're much more electronically conscious today than they were at the time when I did my concertizing, major concertizing. And there's a whole young generation that grew up, I know from my nephews, and they're fascinated by it. But they only happen to know it because they know me. But I think that a wider knowledge of it would be very interesting. Habanera by Ravel.
Clara, you said before that some of the techniques that you developed and some of the actual devising of the improved instrument came about because you, as a musician, had certain demands to make. You do have to be a musician to play the pieces that you work with, obviously. So give us an idea, since you grew up without having heard of the theremin, what is your background? And
Well, my background starts very early, so I will have to be short, otherwise it will take too long a time. I began playing the piano at the ripe age of 2. When I was 3, I could read music and solfege. When I was 4, I was already an unofficial student of the conservatory at Petrograd. And at
Petrograd is
which is
what these
Leningrad
days?
today. It was
Well-
Petrograd in my time. That dates a woman, you know, that's dangerous. And I was accepted as a full-fledged pupil at the ripe age of 5, which was an unknown thing at that time. Of course, my sister being a pianist helped me to develop musically. I always heard music at home.
Well, I remember that she really could play the piano before she could speak. She actually couldn't speak yet. She was still talking baby talk, but she could pick any tune on piano.
I began my musical studies, interestingly enough, even at that early age, as a pupil of Leopold Auer, which was quite unusual. I worked with his assistant in the beginning, who sat on a little stool because I was so tiny that otherwise she couldn't see me. And that is the beginning of my background. And of course, later, as young girls, both my sister and I began to concertize at the age of 6. And we gave joint concerts, playing the violin and the piano, all over Russia, then all over Europe, and we played our way to America.
The technique that you use, the finger technique of getting 2 notes and controlling the vibrato and so forth, was that also a process of long trial and error?
This was not a process of long trial and error. It was a bare necessity of a musician like myself when I play violin music or when I play cello music, I want to try to do what the composer intended when he wrote it for a certain instrument. For example, I have a limited bow, a limitless bow. I could hold a note forever. But in the composition, you have to simulate the limitation of the bow, that you change it. And I do it deliberately. I have to play the rests as well as the notes to make them stop in between. And I developed my own, completely my own finger technique, because before me it was all glissandos. And that again was musically not valid enough. And I developed a finger technique, which enables me to make definite notes. Of course, you have to be a little courageous and jump at the note instead of sliding into it.
Yeah, Mrs. Rockmore has touched on something that Tom and I have observed over and over again, that it's impossible for an inventor or a scientist to come up with a musical instrument out of his own head. There has to be a collaboration between musician and technician. And Tom has looked into the history of electronic musical instruments going back just about 100 years, haven't you, Tom? It's always the case.
finished? Can I turn it off? Hooray!